We have a great first research panel this morning titled Evaluating the Role of Gender Bias in Public Perceptions of Women in Power. We have a couple of great papers we're going to hear here. So the first paper that we're going to hear about is Approval of Female Politicians' Verbal Aggression Differs According to Their Clothing Color. Further Evidence for the Petty and Pink Effect. That's by Adam Richards and Patrick Rice of Furman University. And then the second paper we're going to hear about is Supreme Court Nominees, Political Implications of Motherhood Rhetoric, which is by Michelle Irving of Rutgers University. So we're going to hear a couple of different papers here, but both related to gender. So I think this is going to be a really great panel. So our first speaker is Adam Richards, who is an associate professor of communication studies at Furman University. His research and teaching focus on the effects of persuasive messages on attitudes and behaviors across a variety of contexts, including politics, public health, and misinformation. He's particularly interested in studying message features that have unintended persuasive consequences. He's authored numerous articles throughout a lot of different journals, including Communication Monographs, Communication Research, and Human Communication Research. So let's give a very warm welcome for Adam Richards.
Thank you. So you all made strategic decisions this morning when you woke up and put on pants. None of you are here pantsless. And some of you combed your hair. And Andrea put on a nice brooch. Yesterday I saw that Sean was wearing socks with eggs and bacon, images of eggs and bacon on them. I put on a tie so you'd think I'm less of a Nimrod. So the decisions we make and the way we dress ourselves, we make perhaps accidentally, but they're still strategic. And we make them sometimes for deliberate symbolic purposes, and sometimes we just make them because we need to put on pants for the day. So regardless of whether we are intentionally dressing for a specific purpose or we're just dressing to meet social norms, what we wear can convey meaning. And that is the purpose of this paper. That if the color selected by a female politician in a speaking situation, if that has implications for how the content of her speech is perceived. So what color, you may ask? This research focuses on pink. For a variety of reasons, but mainly because there is a social movement that pink is symbolic among female politicians as a message of power, that pink symbolizes feminist agency and efficacy among politicians. So in the 2020 election, a number of people wore pink to the ballot box to represent feminist agency in politics. And you can see this tweet from Instagram. I'm not on social media, so I don't know. Some social media post from Hillary Clinton about pink symbolizing powerful women. Now here's the problem, is that pink may not actually symbolize power for constituents. And this is particularly relevant for female politicians because they face a dilemma in their communication choices. Kathleen Hall Jamieson identified the double bind among female leaders, but particularly among female politicians, that they must conform to two seemingly mutually exclusive stereotypes. They must be assertive, which is a marker of masculinity, as well as nurturing and caring as a marker of femininity. They're expected to be both of these things at the same time. And that's difficult. So the way that female politicians engage in strategic linguistic choices has implications for the success of perceptions of credibility, as well as the success of their persuasive speech. And there are a variety of theoretical perspectives that can explain such expectations. Language expectancy theory is one, which simply suggests, among other things, that we have expectations for how men and women engage in persuasive speaking, or persuasive language choices. We sanction aggressive speech more so for men than we do for women. And therefore, when women use aggressive speaking to persuade, audiences generally find it less permissible because it violates their expectations in negative ways. So men can get away with more aggressive speech than women, and we find generally verbal aggression in the political context to be used more by men than women among politicians. So verbal aggression, you'll see the definition here, includes insults, ridicule, attacks on another characters or competence, which is, especially as of late, a very frequent message strategy used in political discourse. However, perhaps because there's this implicit understanding among female politicians that this is not generally thought to be a successful strategy, they don't use aggression as much as male politicians, at least in this one study among US senators. So one theoretical perspective is that female politicians, relative to males, are sanctioned when they use aggression. Another perspective, because there, as with most social scientific evidence, there's contradictory evidence. But another perspective is that because female politicians do convey notions of femininity, they can get away with further aggression because it's not perceived as aggressive coming from a female politician compared to a male politician. So, where does the role of pink come in? We conceive of pink as a nonverbal prime to femininity. And indeed, the color conveys notion of feminine stereotypes. So how does pink, in combination with some linguistic choices that female politicians make, modify the public's perception of verbal aggression? On one hand, pink might make verbal aggression less permissible because it primes notions of pink and therefore creates expectations of feminine speech. Therefore, verbal aggression is less permissible. On the other hand, the priming of pink may make verbal aggression more permissible because female politicians are perceived to be even more characteristically kind, and therefore their verbal aggression is not seen as aggressive. So here we have two competing expectations. And so overall, we're interested here in how does wearing pink affect the persuasiveness of verbal aggression. And we asked this question in a study published earlier this year, and the results we coined as the petty and pink effect. But we specifically hypothesized two competing hypotheses that pink might afford verbal aggression more persuasiveness or might detract from the persuasiveness of verbal aggression. And in a controlled experiment where we lied to our participants, we showed them a screen capture of Kamala Harris. And here are 4 different versions of that screen capture. So this is a between participants design. People only saw one of the images, and we asked them their impressions of the candidate and their related impressions of political attitudes. So on the left, you'll see the 2 versions that are low in verbal aggression, that lack verbal aggression. Trump is president, it's time for a new leader, which we totally made up. On the right, you'll see the equivalent high verbal aggressiveness versions of that statement. Trump is the president, but he's a crooked, dishonest, hateful moron. It's time for a new leader. Character attack. And we asked people to view these images and asked them about their impressions of Kamala Harris as well as their attitudes towards Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And this is what we found. We found that perceptions of Harris's femininity and competence were higher when she wore pink as long as she used low verbal aggression. However, when she used high verbal aggression, she paid a penalty for wearing pink. That is, verbal aggression was more persuasive, at least in perceptions of the source, when she was not wearing pink. It was more high verbal aggression and pink was less persuasive, and low verbal aggression and pink was more persuasive relative to the gray comparison. And these same relationships carried over in how people perceived Joseph Biden and Donald Trump after viewing that screen capture. So message-consistent attitudes here. That they were more favorable towards Joe Biden after seeing Kamala Harris in pink using low verbal aggression, and more favorable towards Joe Biden when she was wearing gray and using high verbal aggression. So these results comport with a language expectancy explanation that pink, or at least what we argue, that pink primes notions of femininity, creating further expectations for feminine speech. Therefore, when masculine, i.e. aggressive speech is used, those those expectations are further violated and translate into less persuasion. Now, on to the current study. So this was the overall finding, that pink versus gray decreased persuasiveness of aggressive language, but increased persuasiveness of unaggressive language. And the purpose of this study using the C-SPAN video library is to try to replicate this effect in a more ecologically valid context, where we're using a real politician language and real wardrobe choices. So the difference in what we're doing here, overall the sentiment is the same, and the purpose is the same, but we're using more message iterations. So we use multiple speech acts from a politician, and we're also using more colors. So we're comparing different shades of pink, or we're clumping different shades of pink together instead of just one Pepto-Bismol shade. And we're also able to compare multiple speech acts. We're using video stimuli rather than a screen capture, which is perhaps a more crude assessment of a speech act. And we collected data outside of the general election. I failed to mention that that study was conducted the week before the general election in 2020, when, perhaps people were feeling, particularly strongly in certain ways. And we used a different politician. Which politician, you may ask? Nancy Pelosi. So Nancy Pelosi, as you all know, is another high-profile politician, and her clothing choices have also been covered in the media. So we felt that this was a suitable case in which to replicate the petty and pink effect. So we can't see it due to this bar at the bottom, but the overall hypothesis is to replicate that finding that we previously found. People evaluate Pelosi more negatively while wearing pink compared to other colors when she uses high verbal aggression, but people evaluate Pelosi more positively while she's wearing pink when she uses low verbal aggression. So to test this hypothesis, we combed the C-SPAN video library for appropriate clips by which we could show Nancy Pelosi speaking in verbally aggressive and unaggressive ways while wearing pink and other colors. And we landed on using House majority-minority briefings because it featured close-up shots of Pelosi. She wears vivid colors, and she's speaking uninterruptedly. So it was a nice context for to provide some level of control in just the nature of the images. And it hasn't been explicitly mentioned, but a number of presentations have used this feature on C-SPAN. You're able to create user-generated clips and embed those clips in our case, Qualtrics, online survey platform of Qualtrics. So what we did was we started with much more than 16 clips, but narrowed down the clips that we selected to 16. And 8 of those were Pelosi wearing pink. 8 of those were Pelosi wearing non-pink colors, which included yellow, gray, blue, white. And 8 of those were ostensibly her using high verbal aggression, which I'll show you a couple examples of in a moment, and 8 of those using low verbal aggression. So we used a cross 2x2 design, so 4 groups, which simulated the previous experiment. And we also used a between subjects factor of party identification to see if these effects varied based on participants' party ID. We also pilot tested these clips in the absence of color cues. So we took the transcripts of these clips and asked people to rate the verbal aggression of the text, just the written text. And we showed that there are strong effects for verbal aggressiveness based on our anticipated, the clips that we identified as high and low verbal aggression, but no effects for color in the absence of color cues. So it's feasible to assume that verbal aggressiveness was constant across color conditions after this pilot test. So here's a couple examples. We can't see the most verbally aggressive part. So you can see in low verbal aggressiveness, good morning, and a good morning it is, sorry, versus the high verbal aggressive. Here's an example of a high verbal aggressive message. There's an investigation of federal dollars being spent at Trump-owned properties. This is beyond appalling, but how can anyone be appalled? We've seen it all before. In terms of integrity, the administration is having a limbo contest to see with itself to see how low it can go. And then another example of a high verbal aggressiveness message. You're asking me about the appropriateness of the actions of this president of the United States. So completely inappropriate in so many ways that it's almost a given. It's like a child who comes in with mud on their pants or something. That's the way it is. They're outside playing. He comes in with doggy dew on his shoes, and everybody who works with him has that on their shoes for a very long time to come. Okay, so we conceived of these messages as capturing high verbal aggression. So using a within subjects design, we showed these 16 clips to 86 undergraduates from participant pool at my university. And we asked them about their demographics and party identification before showing these clips to them. They then watched the 16 clips in randomized order. Each clip was on a separate Qualtrics page with the questions immediately below the clips themselves. So it really created a nice interface for answering questions in response to the clips. And we simply asked them what they thought of Pelosi in the clip that they just watched. And we asked them about her combativeness to capture verbal aggression, compassion, trustworthy and knowledge to capture degrees of source credibility, how likable and persuasive she was thought to be in that particular clip. And then we averaged the 4 clips within each condition into a measure to summarize people's perception of Pelosi when she was speaking with that level of aggression and wearing that color. And there was acceptable reliabilities in each of those conditions. We then subjected those 4 measures, repeated measures, to within subjects ANOVA, comparing people's perceptions of Pelosi in those 4 conditions. And overall, here's a summary of these findings. That there are consistent color effects, so a main effect for pink versus non-pink colors. And the general trend here is that pink is preferred, that people confer more credibility, likability, persuasiveness to Pelosi when she's wearing pink over non-pink colors. Not super surprising. Again, with our verbal aggression as a predictor, not super surprising that people conferred more credibility when she was using low verbal aggression compared to high verbal aggression. So they thought she was more compassionate, trustworthy, knowledgeable, and likable when she was not using high verbal aggression. And then some relatively consistent effects with party identification as well. As you can probably imagine, people who identified as Democrats liked Pelosi, thought she was more credible in many of these measures compared to independents and Republicans. Some of the measures, independents and Republicans were equivalent. Some measures, independents were in between Democrats and Republicans in their perceptions of Pelosi. But importantly, we also see some significant interaction effects, and that's what I'll discuss now. So there are some significant two-way interaction effects between color and verbal aggression, as well as verbal aggressiveness and party identification, and then one three-way interaction between the 3 predictors. So when it comes to the two-way interactions between color and verbal aggression, here we're looking at perceived compassion. You'll see that Pelosi is perceived overall as more compassionate when she's using low verbal aggressiveness, but that's especially the case when she's wearing pink. So pink makes low verbal aggression even more compassionate than people otherwise would perceive it. In regard to perceived knowledge, you'll see that, again, pink is preferred to non-pink colors, but the bigger difference come with high verbal aggression. So she's particularly more knowledgeable when she's wearing pink relative to non-pink when she's aggressive. We see a smaller difference when she's not being aggressive. The three-way interaction involving these two variables as well as party identification. The main difference here is that between Democrats and independents. So pink is preferred in low verbal aggressiveness conditions for Democrats, but in high verbal aggressiveness conditions for independents. Whereas for Republicans, there's a slight preference for pink, but it does not differ according to the aggression that Pelosi used. And then just for posterity, the interactions not involving color, but involving verbal aggressiveness and party ID, these align with your expectations, I imagine, that we see slight reductions in high verbal aggressiveness, perceptions of trustworthiness, but this is particularly the case for Republicans. And that generally is the pattern for perceived knowledge. Slight reductions in perceived knowledge when Nancy's being mean, but particularly the case for Republicans. And then this is for perceived persuasiveness. The same effect for Republicans, but a slight increase for Democrats in how persuasive they perceive Pelosi when she's being aggressive compared to unaggressive. So what did we learn? Well, the effect between Pelosi compared to Kamala Harris was not replicated. The first part was, whereas there was a benefit for pink when not being aggressive. We replicated that here. So Pelosi, like Kamala Harris, when she wasn't particularly engaging in vitriolic political attacks, pink was preferred. There was a persuasive advantage, at least to the credibility conferred to Pelosi when she was wearing pink. However, unlike what we found in the previous study with Kamala Harris, where she was penalized for wearing pink when using verbally aggressive attacks, we didn't see this same penalty for Nancy Pelosi. That pink was still beneficial, or at worst made no difference when Pelosi was using verbally aggressive attacks. So this quote-unquote petty and pink phenomenon that we coined in the previous study wasn't replicated here. Did pink have effects? Yes, but not the types of effects that were penalized among people assessing Pelosi's credibility. So she did not pay out the penalty for wearing pink when using verbal aggression like we showed in the previous study. However, her credibility did generally suffer when using aggression. So in line with language expectancy theory, where people expect female speakers to not be aggressive, these results align with that to the degree that Nancy Pelosi is a female politician. However, when we prime femininity and make her, quote unquote, more feminine, we didn't necessarily see the effects we were expecting. So partial replication of the petty and pink effect, but this suggests that there are additional considerations that might determine when pink is penalized and when pink is privileged when using verbally aggressive attacks. So there are a number of differences between these studies that might implicate when pink would be beneficial or not. One is the politician's race, of course. One is the election season differed. This is the great thing about studies like this, is that now it raises more questions than it answers, and this is how research programs begin. However, there are some, if I was a political advisor, there are some key takeaways here that would be consistent across studies, and one of those is when you know that when you deliberately know you will not be engaging in political attacks, it's beneficial to wear pink, because your speech is perceived as more credible than it otherwise would be. Now, whether or not you should wear pink while engaging in political attacks, we have contradictory evidence. So I'm less sure about the pragmatic implications in those contexts. So, this is one study. So there, as with all research, there are limitations here, but one potential limitation is kind of the unfortunate aspect of ecologically valid studies, is that here we try to replicate the effect using real video clips of Pelosi, but there may be differences between those clips besides high verbal aggression and besides color. So just as a silly example, in the 8 pink clips that we selected, she was wearing a necklace. Maybe she just had fewer necklaces to go with pink outfits in 2 out of those 8 clips, whereas she was wearing a necklace in a greater proportion of clips when she was wearing non-pink colors. Now, I highly doubt that there's a necklace by verbal aggression interaction. I have no theoretical reason to believe that's the case, but that's technically possible. And further, in the high verbal aggressive conditions, she was attacking Trump in the majority of those clips. So it may not just be verbal aggression effects across the board. It may be exclusive to one particular candidate. We have generalizability sample. We were using a convenient sample here among college students, and the generalizability of Pelosi and how these effects might apply to other female politicians, or even to Pelosi speaking in other contexts other than House majority-minority briefings. Great, thank you.
All right, Adam, thank you for a very great presentation. We have a few minutes here for some questions, so I'll come around with a microphone and we can get some questions going. Or I guess I won't.
Hi, I just had a quick question about the study itself, because it interested me, again, coming from a media perspective. The images of Kamala Harris you showed that were edited for the color and then the news headline attached to them, were those shown as just still images, or did you edit? Okay, so now do you think it might be, so the difference in data gathered, do you think that might arise due primarily to not being able to identify with vocal inclination or tone of voice or facial expression how the new population was able to with Nancy Pelosi, because of the still images not having that same medium, through C-SPAN's recordings and stuff like that, and just being just a still image. So there's no inclination to tell how she's saying it, the inference of words and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That generally verbal aggression is conceived of as a language-based phenomenon, but presumably when you're more aggressive, you change your delivery as well. So on the whole, she was pretty cool and collected, even when she was talking about dog-eat on people's shoes. She's not pounding the podium. But yeah, that's absolutely a valid criticism. And to me, suggests questions that should be pursued. How does verbal aggression paired with nonverbal delivery further impact these effects? Thank you for the comment.
Hi, I really like this paper. I just want to, question, so the divergence of your findings between the first study and the second, I wondered, did you consider black women stereotypes? Because I think, with Kamala, I think it could be potentially regardless of what color she's wearing, given her facial expression, because black women can't express anger, people might have penalized her more because of the color. So I just wondered, perhaps there's an opportunity in your future study to consider additional races there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, I also wondered with Pelosi, well, I know your N's not big, but it would be really interesting to see among respondents if there's differences among gender and sort of the pink effect.
There were not, but
okay.
Yeah, and there were not in both studies.
Yeah.
So, we're not looking at huge sample sizes here, but within subjects design, we're able to find pretty significant effects, and that's more normal to do within subjects design with lower sample sizes like this. But all good questions.
Loved it. Great, very good study. Couple of questions. You kind of alluded to it at the end here. My first question: why choose Pelosi? It seems that she's already got a valence, right? So, why choose her and not if you realize this may be a limitation? And then, secondly, I'm trying to think. We one of the headlines indicated this too. Kind of over scrutinize what women wear, and then kind of do these elaborate studies like you're doing. Do the equivalent potentials exist for men and what they were. I mean, I'm thinking of Obama's tan suit debacle, right? I mean, is there enough for how we might replicate the study on male politicians?
All good questions. Regarding the latter, yeah, I don't know if we could feminize a male politician through color. Like John Boehner was notorious for wearing pink ties. Or I don't know how notorious he was, but he was the only politician I'm aware of that deliberately does that. You know. So yeah, that's something to explore. I have looked at whether red versus blue ties convey, political influence among politicians based on partisanship, and generally the literature on that is inconclusive. But this is obviously different from that question. So, yeah, the idea is that do male politicians pay a penalty if you feminize them, quote unquote, with pink, assuming that's even what's happening? Yeah, that would be, here we can collaborate. So in your first question, why Pelosi? Yeah, this is hard. We wanted to have some consistency. We also didn't want to overly burden participants with, 130-second clips, which would, not be realistic for us to get very valid data there with, a variety of different politicians. So, yeah, in some ways we in a study like this where there are so many unmeasurables that are uncontrolled, we wanted to have at least some control. So we were comparing pink effects, not necessarily politician effects, which is why we chose a single speaking instance or a context of her kind of visually framed similarly. But absolutely, like different politicians, or this could be replicated with a variety of unknown politicians that vary by race, that vary by sex, or how masculinized a politician is, a female or male politician. So yeah, these are all good things. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. Great presentation. I dressed up just for it.
I wasn't going to call you out.
I did want to say I'm not surprised by the difference between Pelosi and Kamala Harris. And as you said, there's probably something to do with race there, and that black women tend to be more masculinized in general. So I think that would be, ripe for future research. I also, as you mentioned, like doing it with unknowns relatively. I'd also be curious, especially your article from 2008 about aggressiveness, and there's not as much aggressiveness. I'd be very interested to see, like, from my own presentation, looking at like Marsha Blackburn since 2008 and
Sure.
Republican women as well, because I think they have they don't have like a feminist twist, but it's a different kind, and I would be interested in seeing that in the future. But yeah, and if you have any predictions on how that might be different. Yeah.
Yeah, in regard to the political affiliation of a speaker, I don't know, right? Obviously, the two studies that have been done on this to date have looked at Democrats, but certainly conservative politicians also wear pink. So, yeah, the great thing about doing a study and acknowledging its limitations is that it's low-hanging fruit for further work. So yeah, whether if you identify, I guess for consistency's sake, you'd have to have an unknown politician that you identify as Democrat or Republican, and see if those pink effects carry over, analogously to both parties. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Adam. Okay, excellent. So our next speaker is going to be presenting on their paper titled Supreme Court Nominees, Supreme Court Nominees. I misread that. Supreme Court Nominees, Political Implications of Motherhood Rhetoric. And this paper is by Michelle Irving, who's a PhD candidate at Rutgers University. Michelle Michelle studies political science at Rutgers, where she studies more specifically gender and politics with a regional focus on American and Canadian politics. Her research focuses on the intersection of parenthood and politics, as we can see from this paper, candidate emergence, and political psychology. She mainly uses computational methods, voter behavior surveys, and experiments to analyze how gender, parenthood, and race influence voter perceptions of political candidates. She's an SSHRC doctoral fellowship recipient and the graduate editorial assistant to the journal Politics and Gender. At Rutgers, she also has worked as a graduate research assistant for the Center for American Women in Politics, and prior to graduate school, she worked in government communications in Canada. Very, very nice to have you here, Michelle.
Great, thank you. So I really want to thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's been a really great experience, so thanks to Andrea for organizing and Robert, this has been super. So I'm presenting some work that's sort of tangential to my dissertation work, looking at sort of the intersection of race and gender and political rhetoric. So my motivation for this study, so in the last 2 years, the Supreme Court has nominated 2 working mothers to the bench, Amy Coney Barrett and Ketanji Brown Jackson. And there were several references to justices' historic nature, so throughout the hearings, there were several references to the justice's historic nature. So particularly for Amy Coney Barrett, there was a lot of discussion about her motherhood as a potential qualification. And Ketanji Brown Jackson also is notably a mother, as well as the first Black woman nominee. So parenthood and motherhood distinctly shape politics in a number of ways. Scholars have looked at it in terms of parenthood and motherhood has specifically been really politicized in terms of rhetoric. Identity has been more salient among candidates and legislators in the last 20 years, but there remain a number of unanswered questions. Particularly around sort of this universalized idea of motherhood. So there's, questions around sort of the intersectionality of it, and this case provides really great opportunity to look at sort of Black motherhood and politics and how people are talking about it. And then it additionally provides an opportunity to consider elite perceptions and rhetoric of motherhood and race. So specifically for this project, I'm looking at how is motherhood universalized, racialized, and or invisibilized in elite rhetoric. So I consider both how the nominees talk about their motherhood throughout the hearing process, as well as how the senators speak about it. Today, I'm just going to focus on how the nominees themselves sort of position their motherhood. And so my case studies look at the Supreme Court nominee hearing. Each of them had a 4-day hearing period that I focus on. So I sort of ground my work in 3 theoretical frameworks. The first, as I mentioned, is politicized motherhood. So motherhood, generally, like I said, it's very essentialized. It's also a cultural concept. There's no one definition of motherhood. It changes over time. And it's really risen in its use in politics in the last 30 years. So there's been an increase in terms of maternal appeals and frames among candidates. So Sarah Palin's a really great example, talking about how she's a grizzly mom and has to protect her children. There's a number of conservative sort of maternal stances. Also, candidates will often say, I'm a mom, I have to balance the budgets, therefore I'm running for office. So those are very common, as are sort of warmth-carrying maternal frames. And so some scholars have coined this idea of politicized motherhood that connects a candidate or legislator's parenthood to issues that aren't specifically related to sort of the maternal realm. So if a candidate can say, I'm a mom, therefore I really care about cleaning the streets, that's a significant issue. That's sort of an example of politicized motherhood. As well, Kathy Weiniger and her work looking at GOP women has shown that identity claims of motherhood have significantly risen from the 90s until the mid-2000s. So she shows that GOP women specifically use their identity as a mother when they're talking about certain issues on the floor between that time period. So it's definitely a growing area that's worth further consideration. I also consider Black motherhood and sort of the historical connection to motherhood and white supremacy. So while I mentioned politicized motherhood, there's also this conception that motherhood is universalized, and when we think about it, it's perceived as being very white and upper middle class. Most of the literature in political science, as well as other disciplines, looking at candidates or legislators, if they're doing experiments or anything, they very much use white women as sort of the norm to consider parenthood. They use white names, so they don't consider these intersections. We know there's a long history of Black women's erasure in American society. A number of Black feminist scholars, have pointed to a number of historical examples of Black women being overly masculinized or erased, and there's questions of whether or not they are women to begin with. And then, of course, there's a direct connection between white supremacy. So, of course, Black women, even after the enslavement period, they were still in, challenging economical constraints. So they had to work in the domestic sphere of white homes. So they were often, doing domestic sort of maternal roles in service to white families. That led them having to leave their own children with other people in their community. So that led to problematic stereotypes of them being sort of like the strong Black matriarch, as well as questions of emasculating Black men because they were working in those domestic spheres, and just generally questioning their parenthood because they were not parenting their children like the white women because they were serving white women. So that's led to a number of stereotypes that we still see are very prevalent today. So that includes, the strong Black matriarch, as I just discussed, the welfare queen, which considers Black women, being poor and subsisting on government welfare. Jezebel is sort of this idea that Black women don't necessarily have stable, nuclear family homes. They may have, multiple children from multiple partners. And then there's also this strong salient link between trauma and grief and Black parenthood. So we've seen that in the last decade, rise substantially with the number of Black children that have been killed by police and mothers speaking out. So there's that link, but that's really quite narrow in terms of how Black women can sort of make claims to motherhood. And then the last theoretical framework that I ground this work in is sort of race-gendered institutions, and specifically Congress, and there's been quite a bit of work on this. So Hawksworth really developed this idea and kind of notes institutions rely on hierarchies based on race and gender, which lead to silencing, stereotype, and invisibilizing of minority groups, and sort of really marginalizing women of color in particular. And then there's been a large amount of scholarship looking at Congress and legislative behavior. Differences between, women are often more interrupted on the legislative floor. They found that having both men and women of color in committees will bring different issues to the agenda. And more specifically in sort of the legal framework, Boyd and Ringhand note that over time, in their analysis, that women judicial nominees face more questions about their judicial philosophy and experience a substantially different confirmation process than male nominees. So that, again, sort of supports the idea that women will face sort of a different experience. So this leads to my expectations for this project between the two women. So I expect that Coney Barrett will highlight her motherhood a lot more than Brown Jackson will. She'll have a lot more freedom to talk about her motherhood, the qualifications, linking it to her work, that sort of thing. And I suspect that motherhood frames will be erased for Ketanji Brown Jackson, given her racial incongruence with the cultural standard of what sort of a good mother is, which are signals of whiteness and upper middle class. Again, there's that long history of Black women being connected to sort of like bad parenthood. And so I expect that when Ketanji Brown Jackson talks about her motherhood, if she does at all, the frames will very much be about like challenges, balancing those sorts of issues rather than positioned as sort of a point of pride or qualification for why she is capable to be on the bench. And so also just as a reminder, I think this is a really great case study because 19 out of the 22 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee stayed the same across both nominees. So the folks in green were the new members for KBJ's hearing, and the folks in purple were on Amy Coney Barrett's and not, Ketanji Brown Jackson. So as you can see, there's a lot of similarity between the two. So to run sort of my study, I of course used the C-SPAN video library API to gather the video and text data, scraping sort of the text. I ran it, so the hearings were each 4 days. However, I scraped text for the first 3 days, which were the introductions, as well as the discussion with the members. The fourth day brought in outside support for the nominees, so I sort of excluded that. And then I did a multi-method analysis. So I began with a structured topic model of the hearing text to sort of get that view with sort of the 3,000 foot of how how nominees were talking about their parenthood, if they were at all, and then did a text analysis of the hearings because I noted that I had questions whether, if a nominee spoke about a mom, were they talking about themselves as a mom, or were they talking about a court case that had to deal with moms or parents? So that's sort of the challenge with some of these words. So I went through and sort of coded their introduction and speech to sort of get the context for that. So what I find is, in terms of topic modeling, so I'm looking specifically at the justices' rhetoric only. I'm not looking at sort of the partisans here yet. I find highlighted in red is sort of the 10th most salient topic. It says law school and work. The additional words were very much about like family, children, husband was in there. So it does demonstrate that both candidates are sort of talking about this sort of like family domestic sphere. There are a couple like nonsensical topics that came out, I need to add additional stop words in the future. But then there were the highlighted in orange were just an example of other more substantive topics that were discussed in both hearings. So talking about sentencing guidelines, for example. So that begins to demonstrate that both nominees were talking about their domestic sphere. So it begins to support some of my findings. Topic modeling sort of allows you to run, a regression so basically demonstrate the differences between how the two candidates are talking about family. And here it shows that Brown Jackson spoke significantly less about family words compared to Coney Barrett. So again, provides some additional support that because of her racial incongruence, she's less likely to talk about her motherhood than Coney Barrett. And then here is just one example of a substantive topic that talked about sentencing guidelines versus the family sort of area, and demonstrates there's no overlap between the words of like children, work, and family. So if it had sort of overlapped into the topic 9, the red words, there would be less confidence that the topic modeling was just gathering words about the domestic sphere and that they might overlap. So gives you a bit more confidence in the topic modeling results. So then I did a content analysis during the nominees' 12-minute opening statement. So that occurs on day one. They introduce themselves, their background, their qualifications. They introduce their family, all these things. So they're each about 12 and a half minutes. And so I coded terms referring to their children, their husband, their motherhood indirectly or directly, themselves as a family, and parenthood. If they talked about their own parents, sisters, brothers, I did not include those. And here there's more support for my expectations, right? So Amy Coney Barrett speaks about her parenthood twice as often as Ketanji Brown Jackson. And notably, Amy Coney Barrett, speaks twice as often about motherhood and more often about her children, whereas Ketanji Brown Jackson, for the majority, refers to her husband and very limitedly, she does not really speak about her motherhood directly. So just some contextual quotes of how they use these differently. So Coney Barrett is very to the point. She identifies that she would be the first mother of school-aged children to serve on the court, and so that reference just sort of shows how she positions her her role and her identity as sort of a qualification. And then she also at one point talks about how she makes decisions and says, I ask myself how I would view the decision if one of my children was the party I was ruling against. Even though I would not like the result, I would understand that the decision was fairly reasoned and grounded in the law. Not sure why there's a question mark there. But it shows a direct connection that she perceives that her motherhood really helps her do her job better and makes her a better candidate to be on the court. Whereas Brown Jackson, we see something completely different. She very rarely refers to her motherhood, and the only time she directly does in that opening statement, she connects it to her two daughters and says, I know it's not been easy as I've tried to navigate the challenges of juggling my career and motherhood, and I fully admit that I did not always get the balance right. So she speaks about it in exactly the ways I would expect, in that it's in terms of challenges, and she's a qualified candidate despite being mother, rather because of her status as a motherhood. And she grounds most of her references to her husband, so she notes that he has a PhD, and that she says, without him by my side from the very beginning of this incredible professional journey, none of this would be possible. So anchoring kind of her success in him pushes back against these problematic Black stereotypes of being a non-normative nuclear family, and demonstrates that even though she has been extremely successful, it's only because she has not emasculated her husband, and he is there to kind of support her work. So sort of my initial conclusions then is I do find support for Coney Barrett speaking about motherhood in more broad terms. She's more free to talk about it in all different ways. So there's initial support that good motherhood rhetoric is incongruent with patterns of Ketanji Brown Jackson. She really does not refer to her motherhood very often, and she certainly doesn't use it in frames of her, as being like a super mom. Rather, she's like, I'm a mom, and despite being mom, I can also serve on this court. And then finally, in terms of my next steps, I'm going to complete the content analysis for the additional days. And then also sort of complete the same process, looking specifically at how Republicans and Democrats speak to the candidates and how they sort of frame their parenthood to compare the differences in terms of how their rhetoric frames that to support those claims. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We have time for a few questions.
So this is kind of like a future what you're looking at question. So I remember from looking at these that Marsha Blackburn, I think I mentioned earlier, was saying, oh, her favorite job is mom. And I kind of took away from it that she was kind of delegitimizing her, so making it look like she was less competent, oh, she's, she works best as a mom, not, a judge necessarily. And I was wondering do you think that based on race, are Black women more penalized for motherhood than white women? Or maybe is there some partisan thing going on there? And I was wondering if you had any insight into that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, I mean, partisanship always 100% plays a role. And I think there really isn't research, unfortunately. So that's why I'm very interested at looking at women of color moms, because research is showing that actually voters like have a preference for white moms running for office. So I'm curious if that is changing for Black women, or yeah, if those expectations are the same. I suspect, I mean, I don't suspect that motherhood is like the most important thing, but I think it plays a role, and I think it probably depends on sort of the type of Black woman and whether she can play into sort of the concept of like respectability politics. I think that plays a role, but I think they are like constrained due to additional stereotypes. And yeah, there's just this concept of them being bad mothers. So I think they will be penalized. And I think that's why she rarely spoke of her parenthood during the process.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you again. Great study. Someone mentioned it yesterday. I forget who, but that these Supreme Court hearings are largely performative. There's not really, we already kind of know the result before we have this discussion. So how much of this do you think would change if it was a potential, like, we don't know if this person is going to get nominated, that there is actually a debate happening here for nomination that isn't kind of predetermined before the discussion?
Like a discussion about like that the parenthood
like
would come up?
Yeah. How might that change if this is actually, these conversations would determine the nomination result?
Right. I think that's a difficult question to answer, just because of how polarized both parties are. I think the question that's interesting is sort of like, why does being a parent matter more for these women? And I suspect if I did a larger study, it may come up a little bit with Kavanaugh, because he's also a parent, I believe, but probably not in these frames. So it's also a question of like, why does this need to come up when really the question is, can you effectively do your job and judge? Whereas like, why does being a mother make you either more qualified or less? So I don't think it necessarily matters whether or not they knew the outcome is predetermined or not.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. So kind of a follow-up on Julia's. In the confirmation hearings, it was pretty clear that there were a lot of senators asking in their opening remarks, talking about her family and that motherhood role. So I think another interesting thing to look at in the future would be how much do senators bring up family in their opening statements for male nominees versus, because they brought it up a lot for Ketanji Brown Jackson, despite the fact that she didn't use that language much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
We can take one more question here if you've got one. Okay.
So you showed that you use some data libraries to collect the data. Can you say in details like how you went about collecting the data? Like when you see the data libraries, how do you go about extracting data from that? Like what's the process of extracting data from that? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I used the API, the C-SPAN API, to identify they have all the hearing data. And so they also have the, the CCT, or the way to get the text. I can't remember what that's called.
The CSV?
Yes, yeah. So I was able to use the CSV to download the text, so that connects basically all the speakers and sort of what they say. It's broken up by that. And then I just ran, there's a couple R programs that, clean the data, go through STM. Yeah.
Any last questions before we finish this panel? Yeah, Andrea?
Actually, this is for both authors. Where do you see the next phase of your research going?
Well, I am currently, I'm very close to doing my prospectus, so that's sort of a priority for me, and it's tangential to this work. So yeah, I hope to continue to sort of like develop this project, and also more broadly consider how moms of color, so not just Black women, but Latina, Asian American, are sort of constrained by their parenthood and legislative. I don't believe she's a mom. Yeah.
I think a neat future direction would be to look at color of wardrobe choices on floor speeches and assess voting behavior subsequently, similar to our discussions yesterday. So more observational data, less experimental. Obviously this, if this is a real effect, we have two replications that pink or clothing color does matter. To have confidence in using it as a diagnostic or a prescriptive, you need to wear these colors for these particular contexts, speaking contexts. I think a lot more work needs to be done. I would be excited about looking at kind of more naturalistic outcomes. One of those might be the persuasiveness of the speech would be, do people align their votes with the speaker?
All right, awesome. Thank you very much to both of our authors, Michelle and Adam. If we could give them another round of applause. All right, thank you very much.